Hi, this is Levi. Before we get into this episode, I wanted to take a quick minute to introduce a few of the other podcasts in the WCF Podcast Network. Tom and Naomi are exploring how we interact in our ecclesial relationships in From the Platform. It's a very in-depth series that is incredibly helpful for understanding and developing compassion and better listening practices. That's From the Platform. Sam Taylor from Cleveland, Ohio, produces weekly devotionals in Pause to Consider. Think Mr. Rogers meets Fireside Chat. I love Sam's humble style and think every episode is fantastic. You can find both of those wherever you get your podcasts or on our website at wcfoundation.org. Now, here's the show.
Welcome back to Little Faith. This is a podcast sponsored by the Williamsburg Christadelphian Foundation. A Little Faith podcast explores both the challenges and hope of living a life of faith. I'm Helen and I'm here with Larry Goodridge from Guelph, Ontario in Canada. It is 9th of June 2020. How are you doing, Larry?
I'm doing very well, and thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure to connect and kind of hear your story and meet someone else in North America, who shares the same faith. Tell us a bit more about yourself, Larry.
So I am a Canadian. I was born in Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada, to parents of Guyanese heritage. My parents individually moved to the UK and then to Canada, where they met and married. I have recently moved back to Canada from the US. I spent approximately 11 years from 2002 to 2013 in the US, and then moved back to Canada, to where I now live and work with my family in the city of Guelph, Ontario.
Great. And it's 9th of June 2020. It's been a really tough 2 weeks. Well, it's been a tough couple of months, but these last 2 weeks have been particularly tough, haven't they? And so in your own words, can you tell us what's been happening over the last few weeks? To give context to anyone listening who's either not in America or who's listening to this podcast in the future.
Yeah, so certainly, the past 2 weeks have been difficult with the events in the U.S., the unfortunate events surrounding the death of George Floyd. But really, for me, that a lot of people are focusing on that event. I think there's a danger in that because, first of all, in the past few months, there have been a number of Black people who have died under unfortunate and potentially racist circumstances, and certainly, the George Floyd situation has taken center stage because there was video of it, and because the video of it was so chilling. But even beyond the deaths of Black people, I think it's important to understand that those events are still relatively rare compared to the day-to-day challenges that Black people go through. Just before George Floyd died, we saw the incident in the New York park with the woman with her dog and the Black man that recorded that situation. So, and that is just the tip of the iceberg. And I think for me, the situation with George Floyd saddened me and angered me, because not only was a life taken, but it really brought back all of the daily challenges that certainly I go through and other people with Black skin. So the last 2 weeks have been challenging. On the positive side, certainly there have been a number of people in our community, such as yourself, who have reached out and offered support and have offered to listen and have pledged to learn. And based on what they hear and what they learn, they've pledged to act. And for me, really, those are the three words that I think I'm going to come back to a lot during this podcast: listen, learn, act. And I think if we can do all of that, then there is a way forward to really help those. And it's not just Black people; it's really visible minorities who may feel isolated within our community.
So tell us a bit more about the daily challenges.
Before I get to the daily challenges, one thing that I've observed is that certainly when I talk with white people, many get defensive. I think that defensiveness comes from two things. Well, really one unifying theme around two separate things. The unifying theme is a lack of understanding of what racism is, and a lack of understanding of what white privilege is. So racism, I think a lot of people think racism is only racism if somebody commits some conscious overt act. It could be calling someone a derogatory name. It could be doing something to them because of their color. But racism is so much more than that. It's conscious and it's unconscious. And all of us are socialized. We've all grown up in a certain society, a white-dominated society, and whether we know it or not, we've become socialized. And so we all have unconscious biases. So even people who don't think that they're racist can act in a way that is racist. And that isn't just white people, it's anybody. And then the second thing is white privilege. And I've noticed people get very defensive because they feel that means that by saying that someone has white privilege, that they have been somehow complicit. And that's not what white privilege is. White privilege is the fact that because of the color of one's skin, life is easier for that person. And that brings me to the day-to-day challenges. So I'll give you some day-to-day challenges that perhaps show some of the things that I have to go through that perhaps someone with white skin doesn't have to go through because of the difference in skin color. So for example, at work, I can be a very passionate person. If I respond loudly because I'm passionate, that has been seen as being aggressive. Whereas my white colleagues who respond in that way are seen as passionate.
Or just excited.
Or just excited. So that's one thing. Going into the store, I've gone into the store before. There was one incident I remember vividly where I went in the store with a white couple, who were my friends. We walked into the store at the same time. The store owner didn't know that we were together. My white friends walked in the store and went to the left side of the store, and I went to the right. And then I noticed that I was being followed by the
security guard.
Now, my white friends, I look over, and there's nobody around them. And they even remarked afterwards, because they noticed that as well, that, the irony of it is that they could have been robbing the store. And the security would never have known that because they were focusing on me. A lot of Black people, Black parents have what they call the talk with their kids about police. And that is, if you are ever in an interaction with the police, like if you get pulled over for speeding, for example, or pulled over even if you're not speeding, because certainly this has not happened to me, but I certainly have friends who've been pulled over by the police simply because they happen to be in the wrong neighborhood, which by interpretation they were in a white neighborhood, an affluent neighborhood, and it didn't look like they should be there, so they looked to the police at least suspicious. So how do you behave with the police? So my parents had that talk with me. You certainly don't argue. You put your hands on the dashboard. You ask calmly if you can move to get your wallet when they ask you for things and so forth. These are all the things that I have to deal with and think about every day that a white person doesn't have to deal with. And so what that does is it adds a layer of stress to day-to-day life. Because it's all, I always have to check myself. I always have to make sure that I'm behaving in a way that society would deem to be acceptable for somebody who looks like me.
How do you think these daily challenges affect your faith?
To be honest, sometimes I find myself questioning why it seems that racism and anti-Black racism specifically seems to be something that has just it's worldwide. It has permeated time, even from biblical times. I think there was anti-Black racism. So in my quiet moments, I try and figure out why. And although there's racism against other visible minorities, certainly in the with this COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen a lot of racism against people who are of Asian heritage, because of the feeling that they were the ones that the virus originated from China, so therefore they are somehow responsible. But even with that, it seems like racism against Black people is particularly extreme. For example, we talk about the killing of George Floyd. We don't see, and while I'm sure police take the lives of other minorities, but we don't see with the common occurrence that happens with Black people. We don't see that with other minorities. So I often wonder, and I do ask God, I wonder, why is that? Why does this seem to be this theme, this global theme of racism? So from time to time, I have to admit I do struggle with that. On the other hand, though, I think I've been very blessed that I really haven't, in terms of comparative to other Black people, and maybe this really highlights the sad state of affairs that I'm going to say this, but the racism that I've experienced, relatively speaking, hasn't been that bad. So I think I've been blessed that way. I also think that I've been fortunate to be surrounded by brothers and sisters who, at least some of them, understand, and have been very supportive. So that helps me with my faith in the times when I feel down or struggling. So any feelings of fear would be, I've never been, I'm trying to think, I'm not really afraid for myself. Like I don't go out and think, and part of that also is where I live. I do, so I live in Guelph. It's a predominantly white city. I think if I was living in an area with higher populations of visible minorities, like Toronto, or some cities in the U.S., I think my feelings of fear might be higher.
Yeah.
Because I do think that people see a threat when there are numbers of people that are large numbers of people that they don't understand. Because I'm here in Guelph and there's very few Black people, I don't think we're really perceived as a threat. So I think that plays into different, potentially, even though there's racism, different treatment than I might experience if I was in a city with a higher population of visible minorities. My fear, though, revolves around my children.
Yeah.
Because I wonder, when they grow up and when they move, where will they move to? How will they be treated? And I don't have the answers to that. So that's, if I feel fear, it would be for my children, not really for me.
And your children are still very young, aren't they, at the moment?
Yes, they're 4 and 6 years old.
Yeah, but old enough to have some understanding. So what kind of things do you talk to them about in terms of race?
So we kind of went back and forth, with this situation. Should we talk to them about it? And we decided no. My son saw on the TV the protesting. He asked about that. We decided we wouldn't tell him yet. For me, I want them to be innocent just a little bit longer. Any discussions we've had on race center around the fact that we are an interracial family. My wife is white and I'm Black, and they're in between. So we have discussions about, they will ask, as innocent children do, about skin color, and they certainly observe that I have dark skin and their mom has, very light skin, and they're in between. And so we talk about that, and we're open about it, and we just explain to them that this is how God made us, and we have different skin color, but all skin is beautiful and everybody's beautiful, and they understand that. And fortunately, they haven't had any, that I'm aware of, any negative experiences. Although I'm always watching for that, because society, the way society is, it's just ingrained in society. So there's all kinds of studies that have shown that children, particularly children with dark skin, somehow learn that they are not as good as other children.
And you mentioned an incident that happened in the grocery store with your wife and your children as well.
Yes. So one of the things that tends to happen, certainly this happens with me, and this is another day-to-day scenario that I have to deal with, but also it also happens with my wife when she's with our children. So for me, I'm always asked, or often asked, where I'm from. And when I respond with Guelph, the second question is, well, where are you really from? And that's, again, something, because the idea being behind that second question, that because I'm Black, I couldn't actually originally have been from Guelph. I must be from some Black country. So that's, again, something that most white people don't have to deal with. My wife, who's British, tells me that, she gets that question because of her accent.
Yeah. And me too. Like, I mean, I'm British too, but I'm half Greek and half Malaysian, but I was born in Britain. And yeah, I do get a lot of those questions. And I think, in a way, when people hear my accent, I'm treated in a different way. And I know that if I didn't have this accent, I had broken English, I would get treated differently, and I would get treated worse. And I think I find that harder to stomach living in the US compared to where I lived in England.
Yeah, and I can certainly appreciate that. And my wife, she tells me that when she goes to the store with the kids, that oftentimes she's approached by people who like the kids, and in the context of that conversation, the question invariably arises, where did you get them from, or where did you adopt them from? There seems to be a lack of understanding that, or realization that those kids could actually have been her own kids. So these are the subtle, what are referred to as microaggressions.
Yeah.
That people who are either belong to a visible minority group, or people who are family members of people who are visible minorities have to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
And even though some of those microaggressions might seem small, because they're so regular, they do really build up, don't they?
Absolutely. It's tiring because you always have to be on guard. For example, back to the person who says, well, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Now, if I respond angrily to that, people will say, well, why are you angry? Like, there's no recognition. So I always have to check myself. I always have to be patient. I always have to, and it can be very, very hard because, just like everybody else, I have tiring days. I have days where that don't go well. And on top of that, there always has to be a layer of behavior and checking oneself for acceptable behavior within the society that I find myself in. So this is where it can be very tiring, especially when that happens day after day after day after day. And certainly, one of the more saddening things is that I can perhaps rationalize that by saying, okay, well, this is the world we live in and so forth. It happens at work, it happens in my daily life. But it's particularly saddening when I go to meeting or gatherings or study days and so forth, and those things happen, because that's the one place where one might expect to feel safe and to feel a sense of community. So that is at those times when those things happen that I struggle with my faith, because one can almost develop a feeling of hopelessness. Because here are brothers and sisters who we're supposed to be a family. We're supposed to be there to comfort each other. And then these things happen, and it can be a bit of a struggle.
Yeah, definitely. What do you want the faith community to hear from our conversation?
Well, so I think, again, in the last 2 weeks, there's been a lot of discussion about George Floyd. I've both online and in person. There tends to be, I see two camps within the community. The first camp is one that tends to focus on the politicized nature of the events and has a response of, we are not supposed to be involved in politics, so this really doesn't concern us. The other group is one that really empathizes with the situation, understands as much as possible, because I do think we have to understand that we can't know what we can't know. For a white person who has never been stopped by the police, or has never had a security guard follow them, or has never been accused of being aggressive when they're passionate, or has never been asked where they're from, or has never been subjected to a racial slur, or has never had the police called on them because somebody thought they looked suspicious because they're just walking down the street, or has never had a job promotion denied to them, or one of a million other things. How can they possibly understand? So I do think we do have to acknowledge that. But I think, to answer your question, what I would like our faith community to understand is that there are brothers and sisters within the community that experience these things every single day. And actually, because they experience it every single day and it becomes tiring, over time, it actually becomes a barrier to their faith and to worshiping. And so now that particularly white brothers and sisters have that knowledge, I think that I would certainly implore them to explore this, to ask any Black people that they know. It could be brothers and sisters, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, we're certainly supposed to be preaching and introducing the message of the scriptures to those who don't know it yet, and that certainly should include Black people. And in order to reach them, we certainly have to have some understanding of what they go through, much like Jesus, who understood the struggles of those that he ministered to. So I think the opportunity is there to reach out to Black people, whether they're brothers and sisters or not, that one may know, ask them about their experiences with racism, much like we're discussing now, taking some time to read and learn about racism. And then from there, trying to come up with a way that one can act to help reduce the burden that with respect to racism that people feel on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing with implicit bias is that we all tend to favour our own in-group, our own crowd, our own experience, and there's work to do to kind of look at ourselves, do the work within ourselves, and do the work within our circles. That starts with our friends, and it starts with our family and our colleagues. It also starts with our ecclesias, and working our way out from ourselves and to the wider community. I read something that someone wrote. It said the Bible envisions a unified church from every nation, tribe, people, and language. And it was quoting Revelation 7, verse 9. I mean, of course, like, the gospel message is for everyone, and we're called to preach to everyone in the whole world, and that God wants people of every nation, tribe, colour, tongue as part of his family. And in many ways, our community and many church communities, I suppose as well, that it's still a challenge to us to kind of look beyond our in-group, to look outside and to be able to show the love of Jesus to all those around us.
Yes, and as I said earlier, I think racism, or perhaps a better word would be prejudice, that existed from biblical times. We certainly see, two examples that I think are particularly relevant. The example with Moses and his Ethiopian wife, and the example where Miriam and Aaron spoke out against him. We're not told that she was black, but I think there's a lot of, if one does some research, I think that's a reasonable explanation, and we're not told that Aaron and Miriam spoke out against her because she was black. But I also think the fact that that's noted predominantly, it's at least the possibility, and we see that God was displeased with that. We also see that the Jews struggled to view an expanded family in Jesus' time. So the Samaritans were particularly viewed with disdain. And we see a fair amount of Jesus' ministry, aimed at addressing that. The parable of the Good Samaritan, the discussions he had with the Samaritan woman. So I think these things have always been there. I think, unfortunately, it's human nature to always look for differences. The first thing is, it's human nature to always try to look for reasons that I should be elevated above you, number one. And then how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to look for differences that we can exploit to achieve that. And of course, it's very easy when the difference is a visual one. So this has always been there, and it's a challenge. It's one more aspect of our sinful nature. I do believe that if we are to be in God's kingdom, we have to overcome that. And we have to get to a point where we do not. I don't think it's a mistake to see differences. I've seen a lot of people make comments who are supportive, and they say things like, "Well, I'm colorblind. I don't see, when I look at you, I don't see that you're black. We're all the same," and that's a nice sounding sentiment, but it's also untrue, because of course you see that I'm black, just like I see that you might be white. And there's no difference. There's no shame in that. That's actually a fact. The goal is not to have a homogenous society, but the goal is to understand that that while we're different, we're equal. And that each of us, because of our differences, whether it may be because of the color of our skin or where we've grown up or culture or whatever, those differences can be celebrated under the umbrella of this faith that we share together. It's our faith that should unify us. And that faith that we have and the commandments that we've been given by God and by Jesus should manifest themselves in our daily lives by how we treat each other. And more specifically, the way we treat each other should be that we should have the utmost care for the well-being of others. And we should certainly not make delineations in how we treat others because of one's skin color.
And talking about the well-being of our brothers and sisters, especially of brothers and sisters of colour, how can we support them better as a faith community?
So I think not to be dismissive, understand the daily struggles that they go through, and really make an effort to understand. And then try to provide support. That could be, regular phone calls and so forth, efforts made to include people of brethren and sisters of color in events. I've heard many stories where a brother or sister of color joins a meeting and they're kind of left out of events, not really included. They feel isolated. Again, when you go through that every day of the week, so to speak, not that we just go to the ecclesia on Sundays, but when you go through that every day of the week and then you show up on a Sunday and it still happens in a place where we profess to understand God and what God wants of us, that can be particularly devastating. So I think more awareness of the challenges that Black people go through every day, and being there to support them, and also standing up when that happens in the ecclesia. I have been made aware of various talks and studies where brothers on the platform have said things that have been openly racist. And, I have not, I myself have not experienced that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about how I would feel if I was sitting in the audience and experienced that.
Mm.
And I think, quite frankly, I think that's completely unacceptable. And I think people need to stand up and say that's unacceptable, rather than being apologetic or ashamed, but nothing ever changes. I think this is these are the things and these are the ways in which brothers and sisters can be supportive. I know that Africa is the fastest growing region for our community. There's many brothers and sisters that are being baptized, and ecclesias are growing. So we have to make sure that we understand the plights of those brothers and sisters. We have a fairly good handle on things like hunger and violence that they go through. But we also need to include racism in that as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And reflecting back on your own life and your own faith, what helps you in those times where you are feeling hurt and angry? What do you draw upon to help you get through those times?
I just draw upon the fact that, as I look back on my life, I can clearly see that God's always been there. I should add, in my life, I've certainly been, I would term my life as successful. In my professional career, I've been very successful. I do not believe that I would have been where I am if it had not been for the support, including strong support of white people. So I've had some very good white people in my life that have really supported me, not just with words, with actions, and gone out of their way. So I look over my life, I look back on my life, I see God, which I also attribute to God. So I look back over my life, I see that God has been there, and I see that there have always been people, that I believe He sent to help me. So that gives me comfort that if that's the way it has been, then that's the way it will be or continue to be. And like I said, certainly in this specific scenario that we're talking about, there have been brothers and sisters who've reached out, and that gives me comfort as well.
But there needs to be more of that.
But there needs to be more. Yeah, the brothers and sisters that have reached out have been very few. There certainly needs to be more. For example, if somebody is in a family and they lose a loved one, everybody reaches out. We all understand what that is like. Most of us have lost loved ones. Everybody reaches out. We understand that people are feeling sorrow. What can we do to help? So my basic point is, let's do the same thing with this, because brothers and sisters are also feeling sorrow. So the same thing. What can we do to help? I often hear people say, well, they don't know what to do, or they don't know where to start, or they don't. What can we do to help? How can we support you? Please know that you are loved and supported.
And some brothers and sisters of colour do obviously live in more urban areas, and they live in bigger cities where they are more afraid about where they live and what might happen to them, even when they're driving or at night time. And I think there are times where if people are worried about driving to church or driving to Bible class or driving to even the grocery store, we simply could offer them a ride.
Absolutely.
Give them the opportunity to sit in the passenger seat and not be in the driving seat, and to be cared for and looked after, and just have one less fearful journey.
Absolutely. That's another thing that Black people often do. Again, I saw online, a Black person said when they in his neighborhood where he lives, when he goes for walks with his dog, he takes his young daughters, because people see him as less threatening. Or when he drives down the street, one person put a big teddy bear in the back seat, because if he's ever pulled over, that makes him look less threatening, like a dad. So I do think, giving people rides, the police are much less likely to pull over a car if it's driven by a white person if there's a Black person sitting beside them. I was remarking to my wife that during this COVID-19 pandemic, where we've all been having virtual services and we're sitting on a Sunday morning with our laptops and service, that it's entirely possible that some brother or sister could be doing that and the door gets broken down by the police because somebody called them. I mean, we've certainly seen that this has happened where black people in their own houses, the police have come in because somebody called, and people have been arrested in their own house. Or as you say, people could be driving to church on Sunday and they get pulled over and harassed. And they're just trying to do what everybody is trying to do, which is just live. And for that. So these are the things that I really want our brothers and sisters to understand: the magnitude of the situation, the magnitude of the problem. It's not just about police brutality. Police brutality is the tip of the iceberg. And it's easy for some to rationalize that, well, if the police were involved, it must be because he was a criminal. So if this happened in the context of that, then why should we care? To which I respond, well, first of all, we should always care because it's a human being. And who knows that human being, who knows what their relationship with God was. Okay. And so all human beings have that opportunity to come to know God. And then if one walks in the commandments, to be in the kingdom. So we should be concerned for everybody on the planet, not just our fellow brethren and sisters. And then when it comes to our fellow brothers and sisters, of course, to just be more sympathetic, empathetic, and to learn more about the plight that they go through. And then the act part, as you've said, these are some ways that one can act to make their lives easier. So even giving them a ride or checking in with them.
Yeah, visiting them
in their homes.
Yeah.
These are all things that can help alleviate the stress.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry. You talked a lot, you said there are 3 things we need to remember: listen, learn, act. Is there any more you want to add about those things?
Just that I think one shouldn't be afraid. I've had people message me and say that, this event has really opened their eyes. They didn't know. They feel ashamed. They feel like they should have known. I don't think anybody should feel ashamed because you can't know what you can't know. We shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't be ashamed that we don't know. But neither should we use it as an excuse. I certainly hope now, because this has been all over the news, that people take an introspective look at themselves and truly ask themselves some hard questions. And one of the first things that one can do is get to know a person of color. Just get to know a person of color and really try to get to know them and try to understand where they're coming from, and not to do it to reinforce any preconceived notions that one might have, because that also happens sometimes. But really to challenge oneself to say, okay, how can I be better? How can I expand, my circle of knowledge, with the ultimate goal of trying to help make this person's life a little bit easier? Isn't that what Jesus did? He healed people, he fed people that were hungry, and he ultimately ministered to them with this message that basically said, your life may be tough now, but if you follow me, then I promise you that ultimately you will have a life where there's no sorrow. But he didn't just give them that message. He actively worked to remove barriers that people had in their day-to-day life that may have precluded them from accepting that message. And that is what I think is so important here, is that these day-to-day situations are barriers that for some might be so hard to overcome that it actually precludes them from hearing and accepting the message. And I think that as we have an obligation, because we've accepted the saving name of Christ, through baptism, we have an obligation to understand those challenges and to actively work to eliminate them.
And that should be our prayer, for those barriers to be broken down and for us to gain more understanding and to really build relationships. And that requires each and every one of us to be more open and honest and vulnerable. And it's uncomfortable. It's not easy. But neither is our life in Christ. we were never promised that there wouldn't be burdens and challenges. And we know that if we trust in God and we trust in Jesus, that we can work together in all these things.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's really what I would pray for and what I would hope to see.
Mm-hmm.
I have to, as a Black person, in order to be seen as equal with my white counterparts, I have to work twice as hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another daily thing that's tiring. Is that we often have to work to exhaustion just to be seen to be equal with what white people are doing. And that's a big burden and a very stressful thing. So that, in addition to the other microaggressions that one has to go through, can really affect one's life. There's all kinds of data, particularly in the US, about the inequalities with respect to the fact that Black families earn less than white families. So what that translates into is that Black people may have to have, and many do have, more than one job to support their family. There's a lot of Black families that tend to, there's a lot of Black children that tend to have only one parent. And there's all kinds of social reasons, which is beyond this podcast for that. So all these things conspire to make Black life very tough. In terms of, again, what can brothers and sisters do? Well, if you know that, a particular brother or sister is working 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet and they're exhausted, offer them a ride to meeting. Or if they can't come to meeting because they're just exhausted, offer to go over and break bread with them, or do the readings or Bible study with them. These are the things that can be done. Knowing that and just saying, well, that's unfortunate, but we're here for you. But there's no action with that. That's like what Paul has said, that if we see our brother or sister in need and we say, go in peace, but we haven't done anything, that really we don't have God's love in us, because God's love requires action on our part. And it actually, to be more precise, it actually requires sacrifice. So we should be willing to help to the point that we're sacrificing something of ourselves. Could be time, could be money, could be whatever, to help make the life of that brother or sister easier.
Thank you so much, Larry.
You're welcome.